All right. So good afternoon, everyone. It's our great pleasure to have here today Professor Laura Roost. She's going to present for this second webinar cycle on political philosophy. Laura Roost's research focuses on care ethics in transitional justice and communities, ethnicized racialized violence, human rights, international law, African philosophy, and civic engagement through service learning. She's a resident assistant professor and the internship director in the Department of Political Science and International Relationship at Creighton University and is affiliate faculty in the African Studies program and in the African American and Black Diasporic Studies program. For 2024-2026, she has served as the faculty associate for academic service, and she worked closely with the program manager for the Office of Global and Community Engaged Learning. She was also elected to the editorial board of the Journal of Political Science Education, and for the American Political Science Association, she has served on the executive council uh, of the political science education section, including as co-chair of the Diversifying PCE committee. So it's a great pleasure to have today with us Professor Roost. The floor is all yours. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. What I thought, or what we had talked about doing was, I'll introduce some of the ideas, the things that I'm thinking about. For those who do really like a visual, there's a couple slides for just some of the longer quotes. There's two longer quotes that I'll mention from some of my research work. Uh, but Otherwise, I'll make this much more conversational, so I won't put the slides up, but you can access them if you would like them. I've also in the chat put a copy to my Everyday Justice piece that focuses more on African populism and transitional justice. So if you have interest in looking at that, there's a it's a free ebook available if for people.
Thank you.
So. Um, what I am looking at is essentially what happens after atrocity happens in racialized ethnicized violence, right? So for communities that have been divided in different ways, gone through violence, and then trying to figure out what do we do next, right? So I started this research actually thinking I was going to focus much more on the legal side of things. Um, so I was looking at Rwanda and Bosnia and Herzegovina because they both had international criminal tribunals attached to them. And when I did my first trip to Rwanda, uh, I was surprised at how few people outside of legal individuals were talking about the international criminal tribunals. It doesn't mean that they weren't doing important work, but just like where was the information going? Um, so as a really good example of this, I went to an outreach office. So the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda is unique compared to the one for the former Yugoslavia in that it had an outreach office based in Kigali, whereas there wasn't a similar sort of thing going on for the ICTY. And this office was physically across the street from this church where a lot of massacres had occurred. And the guy responsible for those was having his verdict read while we were in country, and they were going to do a live stream of it. And when I saw the live stream room, I was surprised how small it was, because the tribunal itself is located in Arusha, Tanzania, and not everybody could go. So they would do these live streams to make it easier for people to access. But again, uh, kind of smaller numbers than I expected. And when I'd asked about outreach to this church across the street, I was told, well, the people have a lot of other things going on. They don't have time to come to these sorts of things because they have jobs, they have kids, they have school, all the things that if you're thinking of care ethics, right, which starts with the whole person as the basis of any ethical decisions that you're making, um, that makes a lot of sense, right? So it took that to kind of jar me because it 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 just matches really well with that first quote. If you're looking at the slides, and I'll say it for those who are not looking at the slides, but at the opening ceremony for the residual mechanism, which was going to and continues to take the place of the ICTR. So it was officially it and the ICTY have both been closed. And now you have this residual mechanism that carries on any remaining work like appeals or anything like that. So the then Assistant Secretary General of the Registrar of the ICTY and the MICT, which is the residual mechanism, started out that opening ceremony saying, quote, "It would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the prescience and maturity of the member states of the United Nations, without which this fight against impunity would never have begun, and justice, conditio sine qua non, to national reconciliation and peace would not have been done." Right. Um, what I so that framing is very common, especially in transitional justice legal literature, right? That you need to have these trials because it creates the conditions of justice under which everything else can happen. Uh, what I found was people continuing on with their lives without the trials. And so I was wondering what is going on, right? And so, informed by care ethics, I was able to kind of think through, you know, where are the sites that they're getting the other things that the outreach office said was more pressing for them, right? The jobs, the kids, trainings, all of that. And I found a lot of non-governmental organizations as providing these sorts of services, some governmental, but a lot of non-governmental organizations. And so, um, that's what really kind of got me into the research. And what I've been researching since then has been um, kind of when do participants say that they feel more that they can live together? So not this kind of romanticized reconciliation, but just when can they live together? And when do they feel like they're divided? So somebody in Bosnia, and I heard it multiple times, but the first time I heard it, I was really struck because we were on this street in Sarajevo. And if you've ever been to Sarajevo, they call them Sarajevo roses, but they're spaces where rockets during the war had hit on the sidewalk and they fill them in with red paint so you can really notice them. But it's actual, you know, targeted sites. And so, we're standing by these things, folks are going about their day. And this person I was talking with talked about feeling more divided now than they did during the war, which is really fascinating, right? Um, and kind of the reasons for some of those divisions. Um, and then thinking to a different kind of feeling, but similar themes that I'd find in Rwanda, where you talk about people being able to live together, even if not perfectly, at least living together, right? So the next long quote, if you're following along in the slides, is one that a survivor told me when we were in a church that had a lot of bodies, so Narama church. So you had some kind of bodies on the wall, you had some caskets, you had some mass graves. It was a very large massacre in a very small church because a lot of people in the area had come there for, um, seeking safety. So, and that had worked in the past in Rwanda. So there'd been these kind of uh, massacres, violence before, but there was always this understanding that if you made it to a church, it was kind of off limits. So it was very different about 94 is the going into the churches. Um, but this woman is talking with me and she says, "You ask me what justice and reconciliation after genocide is. It is this." and she kind of looks at like points to the caskets, and she says, every year at commemoration time, we ask those in the village who killed our loved ones where their bodies are. Every year they don't tell us. I was lucky to find my sister and my mother. That's why she was gesturing to the caskets. But we don't know where the others are, and they won't tell us. Yet we continue to live together. I can go from my house and know that those who killed my family cannot harm me, and those who killed know that we cannot take revenge. This is reconciliation. We live together, right? Um, and so, those themes that coming up of living together, living divided, uh, really helped me to kind of think through the tenets of care ethics itself, and how care ethics and African populism offers a different priorities to transitional justice measures. Now, this is particularly within the African context, but uh, it there are some things that kind of work across. So again, for those who have the slides, if you I have a list of the types of organizations that I went to and who I talked with, kind of numbers wise in those. You'll notice there's a lot more in Rwanda than there were in Bosnia because I was in Rwanda for much longer. Um, but when I'm thinking of care ethics and that idea of starting all of our ethical debates and decision making from understanding persons as whole persons, right? So not compartmentalized, but needing that Toronto and Fisher definition of care being everything that we do as a species to live well and repair the world that we're in. Um, so I kind of really see these four things that care offers to the study of transitional justice or life after atrocity. Um, and I am purposeful with that language of atrocity because the definitions of genocide sometimes leave certain kinds of atrocities out. So if you know anything about Cambodia, and killings in Cambodia, during the special court in Cambodia, they were able to get genocide charges for things like targeting of Thai nationals in Cambodia or for members of religious groups, but there were just tons of killing that were based on ideological identities or right like so if you wore eyeglasses you were targeted, if you were a professor or a teacher you were targeted, right? But these don't fall under the classifications of genocide, but it's still mass killings. So that's why I use that atrocity term. The 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 specifics of legal language is important there. But what CARE offers is kind of this way to highlight that we tend to dichotomize human experience in transitional justice into legal and other, right? So often you'll see people talk about legal transitional justice or truth commissions as transitional justice, but then development is something different, right? And I'm thinking about the ways that economic development and personal development are actually wrapped up in the transitional justice process for communities. It also highlights the ways that even the traditional transitional justice mechanisms are themselves dichotomized. So people will often say, you can choose between retributive or restorative justice, right? So a retributive justice would be a trial, restorative would be truth commissions, amnesties, different things like that. Lustration policies where you forbid certain people from taking political office, that kind of thing. So, um, but it turns out that, you know, rather than totally different options, it could be that these are options at different times. You saw this attempted in Sierra Leone, where they had a simultaneous court and truth commission. Um, they're, so in other words, they're often treated as two opposites when there's a lot more gray and maybe some different ways to think through even those traditional transitional justice mechanisms working together. The other two things, or the other two things that I really see CARE offering is thinking about kind of um, interdependent voices in communities, right? So understanding that people aren't just kind of solitary rights holders, but the way we exist in community. And so when you're going through transitional justice, life after atrocity, um, you need to be a bit more complex in kind of how you're thinking through that, and also how you prioritize concerns about the community to be created and the processes of care to be sustained during and throughout the process. And then finally, this kind of looking for sites of care within transitional justice, right? Um, so who is it that, what are people doing? A really great example of this is like gachacha cases. There's this women's organization that I met with a lot in Rwanda did that would essentially do psychological counseling for folks and then accompany them if they were going specifically to rape gachachas. Because they created a different way to deal with those because there's some problems with how those are approached. And it turns out that rather than that John Hawking quote earlier that I mentioned, where you have the court, and then after the court case, people feel better. The folks actually need something to even be able to go to the gachacha, right? So they needed a support network, they needed healthcare, all of this. Uh, and then, um, oh, and then the other example of that was with the ICTR, the way that they would have survivors come and do testimonies, they'd have to get them sometimes to be able to stay in uh, at the UN property or at the ICTR property in Kigali for a little while to like just medically recoup to be healthy enough to go and testify, and then they get sent back to the community. And so this whole question of like, should you just do that at the time of testimony, or should you think about alternative ways to continue, um, some kind of health administration for survivors. So that's kind of what I was bringing from the care. When I'm thinking of African populism, and if you do populist theory, there's lots of ways. Today, you're hearing a lot about more right-leaning populist theory, more identity-based kind of populist theory. But there is also, within African populism, this idea of kind of if you African solutions to African problems, centering African voices and centering the people as a group, right? And especially focusing on local needs and local voices rather than external expectations. And if you want to have a really good discussion of this or have a really good read about this, I always recommend uh, Oyewumi's piece. She has a whole bunch of pieces, but she talks a lot about the way that gender and the feminist theory approaches gender in ways that miss the mark when it comes to like Nigerian women identities, that kind of thing. So Oyewumi is a good place to go to when thinking about what does what do local needs mean, and what happens if you come to a situation and prioritize your, Western expectations of what's to happen, right? So when they're combined, what I really see them doing well together is both of them have this emphasis on holistic justice claims, right? That people aren't just kind of individual right bearers and you have to address their individual right, that they're part of a community, that the community continues on in some form. Um, so kind of not dichotomizing legal justice alone, right? The other bit is the importance of focusing on power relations, um, uh, political relations, care relations, but how important it is to think through power. And then finally, that the call that both of them have to really prioritize local care interests or local community needs. Um, and so I wanted to keep that a little bit brief. I know I went, I think about 20 minutes which is, I believe what was hoped for, so that we have some time for good debate. I can go on for a very long time about this. So if I don't get enough good questions, then I will do that. But uh,
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, we have plenty of informations and concepts yeah, to unpack and to reflect on. Thanks. I open the floor to questions if you want to type them into Zoom or present them, yeah, present a question yourself or write it down on YouTube. I, while you were talking, I don't know, I had a question. Do you think that somehow, I mean, I know that the notion of care is quite young after all in our society, and even younger is the discussions about care ethics. But do you think is there an intersection, a cause and effect in the lack of care and the importance that we pay to care and the political situations in which we find ourselves, I mean, more or less globally. I mean, it's maybe too general of a question, but
Well,
your
no, I think it does. And I mean, so care really gets, as a political theorist, Joan Tronto is kind of
Mhm.
the main person who brings care into political
Yeah.
theory in the early 90s, well, late 80s, early 90s. Um, and during that time, I think it was prescient, but especially right now, I notice even teaching kind of like when I did a care ethics course before COVID versus after COVID,
Mhm. Mhm.
um, there just seems to be various kinds of societal yearning for actual connections. So I think about this, what is it, the epidemic of loneliness, right, that
Mhm.
people talk about, and this concern about a political sphere that doesn't seem to speak to lived experience, um, and that doesn't seem to have space or time for lived experience.
Mhm.
And so I do think that there is something to, because this is all happening as you're getting um, internet, right? I don't know if you all would have looked at something, because it's a bit dated now, but Robert Putnam in the 90s created Bowling Alone. And so this is this book that says essentially that you used to have folks, even if it wasn't explicitly political, they would be on bowling leagues or other sorts of group activities together. And through the game of bowling, you just end up talking about all kinds of things because it's a long game, right? And so we talked about the ways that people would form communities before, either active church membership, bowling leagues, different sorts of organizations, to the way that you see more people going bowling alone, right? So like there's not bowling leagues as much, or they're starting to come back now a little bit, but uh, there's not as many bowling leagues when he was writing. Um, uh, People are doing more political action through, I can't remember the website, but there where you do the petitions, right?
Mhm. Oh, yeah.
And so you sign your petition, you move on, but you're not kind of part of a group that's regularly meeting. And so we're seeing all those things happening, but we also, especially in the last 2 years, I've just been seeing so many more events that are popping up trying to recreate some sort of person-to-person connection, right?
Mhm.
Um, Whether it's, libraries getting creative and having uh, unique kind of meeting groups. Students themselves seem to be wanting a connection, especially as many of the students today went through some part of their most formative years with COVID restrictions. And so I think part of it does kind of really reflect this concern about community. But I think that care ethics does a really good job of helping us articulate something that is just very human. Um, Something that I really love with Carol Gilligan's newest book. So when she originally did the book, it was in a different voice, and she did the revision last year or the year before. But the revision is titled "In a Human Voice," right? And so it provides a way for us to really talk about that.
Thank you. I mean, the image you gave, living together alone, it's
Hmm.
just perfect. Yeah, and I don't know, it stuck with me the story of these women who find themselves, yeah, to live together with the people who committed atrocities to their families, and yeah, not knowing how to, yeah, to live in that
Hmm.
society, how to restore a sense of harmony and justice after this atrocious lack of care.
Yeah. Well, and especially if you think, because one of the interesting uh, challenges is there's this monthly service, and it by now Rwanda's gotten pretty popular, or like it's more well known, so probably not as surprising to folks watching. But they have this Umuganda service where you every month everybody's required to come and do some kind of community work in their community.
Mhm.
Um, and so this has been a really purposeful um, it's an old practice in Rwandan culture, but the contemporary government has also been really purposeful in using it
Mm.
to bring folks together to do some kind of work together. And then they have like an informational session after. And so it's really quite interesting in terms of bringing folks together. Um, it's also interesting though in that when you talk with perpetrators and you ask some folks why they perpetrated, like it's such an old practice that Umuganda existed, before and leading up to the genocide. And folks, some folks were saying, "Hey, we were told by our leaders that this is our Umuganda." Type
Ah,
like it's like so the ways that the same practice that was used to kind of get people to go out and perpetrate is now being used to try to get people to work together. Um,
mm.
is really
Oh, wow.
fascinating, right?
Oh, wow.
Mhm.
But it keeps taking away, and please engage with questions as soon as you want. And
Oh, well, and now I can't see YouTube questions, so I don't. So if you're seeing YouTube,
yeah, yeah, I'm controlling
okay,
over everything.
okay,
Thanks. What I was about to say is that it keeps taking away agency.
yes,
That's curious. I mean, the problem, what leads up to something that horrifying is that in any genocide is that, yeah, I'm just the instrument of some sort
hmm
of power. And in restoring justice,
hmm
it's curious. I mean, is it restorative truly? How do we do?
yeah. Well, and then how? I mean, because one of the other interesting things, right, is uh, so on one hand, the group sessions kind of provide opportunities for folks to talk. There are concerns about how free do people feel to talk, that kind of thing. There's a really great book by couple great books by Phil Clark who's talked about you can get a really small version of it that is how Rwanda judged its genocide, and it gets you some of the key points in like 12 pages. But uh, he has much longer versions as well. But because gachacha was that same kind of way in that um, gachacha was an old remedy for like my neighbor stole my chicken, right?
Oh, okay.
And so everybody in the community comes together. The people make their case, and the folks, in the community say, "Hey, no, we all know that that chicken was really this person, right?" So kind of smaller,
Mm, I see.
smaller sorts of neighborhood disputes. So it was revised to deal with genocide, even though it had never dealt with that level before. Um, and so there were concerns both about like what do you do if there's no lawyers for the accused? What do you do in these different sorts of situations? But also, what do you do if you can't tell counter narrative sort of thing? But he writes a lot about the ways that Gachacha kind of set up a framework, but then it took a life of its own in communities. So
Mm,
folks wound up talking about a lot more things um, than was envisioned or maybe even intended always.
mhm. Mhm.
And so ways that even because you have to like you have to go to Gachacha, right? Like so you have to go to Maganda, you have to go to Gachacha. Um, but so that the way that people can kind of retake agency back. Um, but when you're thinking African populism, there's a lot of focus on things like consensus democracy and things like being people-centered. But um, knowing what does that look like when you have a lot of diversity among people? Um, and on one hand, it's like, oh, it could be really complicated. But then once you really think through things, there's a lot of diversity everywhere,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Um, and so how do we make sure that these things work well for folks? Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
thank you. Uh, any question from you, audience?
When I can do a bit more context
Thanks.
for
Yes.
the cases because so I've given a couple examples of ways that the Rwandan government has tried to deal with this and
Mhm.
for even I mean there's so many layers of this. So even if you think back to 94 when the genocide was happening, this was a time period when Rwanda had a seat at the Security Council. And so the genocide, until they were toppled, the genocidal regime was the ones telling the Security Council, like, oh, hey, you don't really need to do that much of an intervention. It's just this, right? So you have popularly known books and movies now, like Shake Hands with the Devil by Romeo Dallaire, who is the UN commander there and who had tried to get the mission changed from a chapter 6 to a chapter 7 mission. What that means legally is that you can have more the UN troops can do more engagement. Um, uh, but it stayed kind of a different level mission. But then so folks will focus on that, but not as many focus on even what does dialogue in the UN Security Council look like when you have the country with a seat on the council saying what's going on. And then when the new government came in, um, the they were very in favor of creating an international criminal tribunal for Rwanda, pointing to the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And so they were one of the big, key folks arguing for it. But when it came down to actually voting for the court, they voted against it because the court was not going to permit death sentences because in accord with international law and the Rwandan government at that time said like we think that the death sentence should be on the table as an option. Um, and
Um,
so they've like since then they have gone through different changes. They actually have outlawed the death sentence themselves, and they created leading up to the closing of the residual mechanism of the court. They created prisons that could hold UN uh, UN folks who serving time from the UN Sierra Leone court
mhm.
um, to be able to show that you should consider sending more Rwandan accused back to Rwanda. Like we have a professional legal system that meets international standards. We can do this type of case.
Mhm. Mhm.
Um, so that switch from no to the tribunal because of that to working with it more. Not perfectly. They had interesting back and forths. But when you look at Bosnia, one of the way that the peace was brokered was through the Dayton Accords, right? Dayton, Ohio. Um, and the way it was done, so Rwanda genocide ends with military victory, right? So RPF is able to militarily defeat the sitting government, and they come into power. Um, with the Dayton Accords, folks agreed that there essentially would be spaces for each of the ethnic groups in like federal level government, right? So Bosnian Croats, Bosniaks, and Bosnian Serbs would have specific spaces. And what has happened since then, so you have the flip side of kind of the, how much agency or coercion may be involved in with the Rwanda case. With the Bosnia case, um, eh, you you don't have to argue across any other ethnic groups. So you just have to make the case to your ethnic group to get elected. And
Mm.
so the narratives, like the way folks run for election, is talking about how they were heroes during the war. So you have each three groups talking to themselves about heroic actions of the war and how the other groups are targeting them. And then I mean, it comes down to having schools that um, like it's one building, but if for certain classes, if they're Bosnian Croat, they go one way. If they're Bosniak, they go one way. If they're Serb, they go another way. Um, so in some ways they can learn more things. I mean, when I had gone the first time to Rwanda, this was 2009 was my first time. And at that time, we connected with some graduate students in Rwanda. So they're in graduate school, and they had never been able to learn their, oh no, they were undergrads. But during their primary and secondary education, they'd never been able to learn about their own history.
Oh,
So
wow.
when we went to the Rwanda History Museum and they got to go with, and they're like, whoa, I've never got to see. Because even discussing the history was so dicey that people would spend time learning about like the American Revolution, the French Revolution, but not local history,
Unbelievable.
right? Um, and so even just how to deal with education, right? And so when when people talk about feeling particularly divided after the war in Bosnia, some of it is that, like the way that politically institutions encourage you to not have to talk with anybody else.
That's incredible. We have a question from
Mhm.
Majid. Thanks.
Hello,
No.
Hello.
can you hear
Hi.
me?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you for the talk. I wanted to ask you, since you are in the US, in both cases, the US supported the court, right?
The courts. Yes, yes. The courts are ad hoc courts to the United Nations.
Yeah. So the US supported both cases, like to take them to the court. In the case of Israel, the US didn't support taking Israel to the court.
Mm.
What does that tell us about the structure, the legal structure that you study and you talk about?
Hmm. Well, and part of the challenge with like Israel here court case. So let me, because I'm trying to see the ICC, um, because you have two courts in question going on. Um, so with the ICTR and ICTY courts, they had specific time limits around their area, and US, fascinating thing with the US is that the US tends to be more supportive of these ad hoc approaches rather than standing tribunals. So the internationally kind of standing ones, your options are the International Court of Justice through the UN, right? But to like states are the ones that have to be able to make the case there. So you have this interesting question, like the way that it had to go there wasn't because Palestine gets observer status, but not a member state status in the UN. You have to be a member state of the UN to go to ICJ. So you had to have um, other countries bring it. And then with the ICC, so ICJ, because you're in a philosophy of law course, right? Um, so I can do a little bit more legal. So for the ICJ, they have much kind of broader jurisdiction over different kinds of crimes that can be, or not different sorts of issues that can be brought to it, because it doesn't have to necessarily be crime. It can be kind of any kind of dispute that has a legalistic nature, right? The International Criminal Court is very limited in that it can only deal with war crimes, crimes against humanity, um, genocide, and aggression, right? Um, but the ICC it's separate from the UN court. It does have a way in which Security Council members or the Security Council itself at the UN could refer a case, but otherwise the cases come from either the states' organizations or the prosecutor can investigate because it does more of a European style approach to court cases. Um, and so the problem in both of those, right, is you would think, I mean, both of those, in some ways, a care case would point out how limited that is, that the main paths that you have are either like refugee commission, human rights commission, right? Like individual commissions that offer services, but the main solution options are only legal, right? Like there's not an alternative sort of approach. So this would be one of the kind of criticisms offered by CARE, right? Because even the like the ICC can arrest individual folks. That's why they've done this arrest warrant for Netanyahu. And it does have power in terms of restricting where folks can travel, right? I mean, al-Bashir experienced this in Sudan. There were places he couldn't go to. But uh, they can offer, and they have offered legal opinions, right? The ICJ has offered a legal opinion about what's going on in Israel and Gaza, but there's not an enforcement mechanism, right? Um, so that's not a very satisfactory answer, but the short version is that CARE would offer that idea that like it would question why you have like your options are either to try to get legal findings, and that's kind of it. Yeah.
So my question was, if the US supported the other two cases, not? Why didn't support Israel? The case with Israel,
Oh,
uh,
oh,
and,
okay. So specific
and
US support. Okay.
and
Um,
and and having done that, what does it tell us? If the US doesn't support it, nothing happens. You see that nothing happens to Israel and Israeli leaders.
mm-hmm,
What does it tell us about the whole structure that you talk about and you study and you write about?
mm-hmm. Well, and this is one of the key criticisms of the UN structure, right? Is that any of the P5, like this is why Syria couldn't get. So you see Syria and Libya happen at the same time, and you similar time within a year of each other, and you get kind of united, really quick UN action in Syria or in Libya, all the way up to like removing Gaddafi, right? And then in Syria, you can't get that because Russia and the US supported different sides, and both of them would do vetoes. Um, and so uh, there has been um, like power politics alliances still comes into play within the UN system um, in ways that US has been super public with who it's allied with. And we also know that there have been cases before this where the US has been allied with different kinds of organizations, and they don't change position based on it, right? Um, so imperfect system. The
My question
the
is
US,
like,
I will point out the ICTR was there was a lot of push for it, and the support was partially out of shaming, if that makes sense. So folks were really, really quick to create an ICTY. So the ICTY was created during, like, while the war was still going on in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So very quick, very ongoing. There's this kind of panic that, um, after the Holocaust, everybody was like, oh, never again will there be genocide on European soil. And then you had, right, Bosnia and Herzegovina. Um, Rwanda, a lot of folks, including the US, were looking like they were going to not support it. It was folks led by representatives from Nigeria that really kind of highlighted, like, hey, you all, what's the difference here? It seems that the only reason that you aren't supporting this is because it's an African country. And that seems like it's a problem. So that's what I mean, like that shame argument that kind of sold it. Um, and it worked because people have tried those sorts of arguments since then. Part of it, I think, is the timing. There was the ICTY to look at the same time. Um, and so folks were able to make that argument. I don't know how much the US would have focused if there hadn't been that kind of united push from Nigeria and others to really get an ICTR. So given that and also the US has been very, um, I mean, not just unsupportive of the ICC, but like the US has created various bilateral agreements with countries that say, hey, we agree that, like, we'll never send each other's people to the ICC. The standing law is currently, if you can Google Invade the Hague Act, but standing US law is that if anybody from the US gets taken to The Hague, uh, so, they're captured in some other country that's a member, transferred there under this argument that the US is unwilling or unable to prosecute. That's the only conditions under which they could go. US says that they will physically and militarily invade The Hague in order to get those folks out. So the US does not have a great love for the ICC and historically hasn't, like, it sees the ICJ, but it doesn't really do a lot with it. Like the miracle case was the Nigeria case in the 80s with the US and Nigeria, where the US actually agreed to it, because to go to the ICJ, like, parties have to agree, all of that. And it actually agreed, and it agreed to be held to the ruling. But the big weakness of the UN system is that if you're a powerful state, um, you may not have to support or do as much things with it. And then it leaves, does that mean we don't do anything, or do we just try to do as much as we can? It's not satisfying answers, but it's not shocking to me that the US has taken the stance that it has. And it's just, any of the P5 have this kind of power. Like, so China, Russia, US, especially have had more cases where they've done this, but you can get a bit with France and the UK as well.
Thank you for your answer. Sorry, I was muted as usual. Um, can I ask one question that
Mhm.
brings us a little bit back to what you were saying about, these undergraduate students who didn't know much about their own history. So a curiosity I have is there any philosophical thought? I, I know that philosophy arrives at the very last in these situations, but is there any philosophical thoughts that reflect what happened, or somehow nurtures the arrival of a new mindset? Um, yeah, at what point is philosophy there?
Yeah. Well, and I will say, so in 2012 is when they brought somebody specifically in to create curriculum. So by
Mm,
2015 on, that has been part of the primary and tertiary,
great.
primary and secondary education.
Wow.
Um, so like they came through, they had these commissions to kind of sort out how that would work. Um, and go from there, right? So that has changed. But it was just, think 1994 until, mid
2050.
2010s type of thing. Um, but uh there are things going on there. Um, you have continuing kind of debates about kind of where they're coming from, where they're not. But actually, I think what's really kind of cool or really helpful from an African philosophy and a care ethics approach is actually the older work by Alexis Kagame.
Mm.
So he was publishing in like the 50s and 60s, uh, but he was, and there's similar arguments. If you've read anything by Abimbola about Orisha philosophy and the way that Orisha understandings of the world um, uh, from Yoruba culture, the way that when it matches philosophy, uh, how much language plays a difference in it, right? And how um, you know, what do you do with concepts that exist in Western philosophy but don't work locally, right? And so Kagame was doing this, again, not present, this is Alexis Kagame, 50s and 60s, but he was talking about this idea that uh, you cannot you cannot understand um, Rwandan mind frame, Rwandan philosophy, any of these things, unless you can do it in Kinyarwanda, which is the local language. Um, which another kind of interesting point there is that Kinyarwanda is spoken by all ethnic groups. So there's not there's not dialect differences. There may be regional dialect differences, but um, like across the board, everybody can speak Kinyarwanda. And he was talking about kind of the depth of knowledge you get from a language that has 14 classifications of nouns. So like when you're conjugating, there's like
Mm.
14 ways a thing can be conjugated based on what that thing is. So like, when you're thinking kind of, students in the US tend to be familiar with like Spanish or French or German. This is a lot more classifications of nouns because there's like the way that everything interacts is understood differently, right? And so I think that kind of when I'm thinking of the importance of local voice, right? I'm thinking of the way that Catholics and African philosophy encourage folks like me to kind of step back and say, like, you need like you don't have any prescriptions. You just have ways to understand this, and like you can try to understand, but when it comes to actual prescriptions, like you need to be really wary of like the dichotomous Western approach that says You have to do transitional justice, check. Now we'll have justice. Wait, so you have to do transitional justice, check. Will it be a truth commission or a trial? And then after that, you have to do this development thing, check. And after that, you have to do democratization that looks a very specific kind of democratization, check, right? Um, and so it helps kind of think through how do you balance whole persons, whole communities, um, whole voices. So hopefully somebody like me isn't making like direct prescriptions
Mhm.
because that would kind of be taking out the local voice. Um,
Yeah.
but it's kind of like where is your role? The academic literature that tends to prioritize
Yeah.
legalized voices as the voice, that's where the pause can go.
Thank you. And was this culture taken into consideration in the restorative part of the process, or?
Well, and this is so the Rwandan government was fascinating, right? Because I told you they came into power by military victory.
Mhm.
Um, and so there are certain kinds of things they could have done. Um, uh, in terms of like military victors, they're a bit more restrained than they could have been. Not completely restrained, but they were more constrained than they could have been.
Mhm.
But so things like uh, encouraging gachacha rather than, so they have a national commission, like it's a National Unity and Reconciliation Commission, and they
Mhm.
regularly kind of do events and try to create, community building events, that kind of stuff. But separate from that, they didn't do like a national level
Mhm.
thing. They
Mhm.
did gachacha in communities, which did make things difficult because as people are fleeing all over, not everybody was killed in the community that they're from, type of thing.
Of course, yeah.
But they were like, hey, this is actually like, we're going to focus on Rwandan tradition and Rwandan culture to address this.
Mm.
Um, and that's why we don't need this other approach, right? Because at the same time that this was happening, the South African, right? Because so April of 1994, like the three big things. One is not big, but it explains American attention. But the big things are you have genocide in Rwanda, you have the first ever multiracial elections in South Africa. You have a lot of media focus on that. Um, and then you have the O.J. Simpson Bronco chase. And that actually is what, if you do like a media, like people have done
Okay.
content analysis of US media, once the OJ thing happened, like there was starting to get some attention to Rwandan genocide. OJ happens, and then it just crashes in terms of attention. And attention, it doesn't start popping back up until kind of late summer, early fall when you're having refugee camps in the DRC. Um, and by the time you get to 95, you already have like the whisperings of um, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And so you had folks saying, hey, maybe instead of pushing for this ICTR tribunal, this court through the UN, maybe you do it yourself and you do a national truth commission. And they said, we are not interested in a truth commission right now. Like we're still burying
Mhm.
bodies. We're not, type of thing. Um, and so it's this kind of interesting halfway point. So the government has been focused on that, but at the same time, there have been other moves where they had so many prisons overcrowded that they decided, we're going to have to, we're there because someone had been waiting for trial, waiting for their gachacha. Like, we're just going to have to let some of these folks wait for their gachacha in their community. Now their snafu is they didn't inform the community this would be happening. So one day, like all these released folks from the prisons came back into all the communities. Um, and so that was also interesting. But then you have like folks who've been released, the gachacha comes up, they all go. Um, like everybody relives a thing. They get the sentence at the gachacha, but so they're convicted, but then the sentence was often less time than they had been waiting for the trial, so they were released for time served. And so that was a whole nother challenge of the gacaca process. But that was specifically to try to ground it in local customs. So even the judges, in Yam Gamagayo, kind of they were elected rather than appointed, which led to its own problems because sometimes you would have judge, in Yam Gamagayo who had been perpetrators themselves.
Mm, mm.
Because if you have majority population of perpetrators,
Oh.
so, lessons along the way, but those were Gachacha, Umaganda, and then the third thing they've done that's been a bit more controversial, the Umadugudos, where folks like essentially manufactured communities. So not quite the same as the Umoja villages that Tanzania tried to do economic development, but still like places where folks were moved to live kind of closer together. Um, were all like had some basis in aspects of Rwandan history and culture. And the question since then has been, has it been viewed authentically? Or like, when does it get viewed as authentic? When does it get viewed as as something inauthentic?
Yeah, it's a very important question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, because it risks to fuel even more disparities. Either way.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Thank you, Laura. It was a fantastic presentation, and you brought us a big piece of knowledge, and yeah, gave us the sense of the intricacies that are around. I saw that you are sharing your email, so in
Mm-hmm.
case there are more questions, thank you
Yes.
for your availability. You can connect directly with Professor Roost. Thanks again for being with us today. I forgot to mention at the beginning that this has been funded by California State University East Bay. Thanks again for being with us today.
Thank
Have
you.
a good day. Bye. Bye.